Welcome to Family Betrayal Revenge. Stay tuned. Have a fun time and let's talk in the comment. Let's go!
The day my husband died is burned into me in a way time will never erase. Not because of the rain or the gray sky or the church bells, but because nobody from my family came to his funeral. Not my parents, not my best friend. They all went to my sister's engagement party instead. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments. And I will give you a heart. My name is Jessica Carter, and I'm 31 years old, and I need to tell you about the day I buried my husband alone, completely alone, in a chapel that should have been full of the people who claimed to love me, but instead echoed with the kind of silence that screams louder than any words ever could. The day Daniel died, the day I lost the only person who'd ever chosen me without conditions, without comparisons, without ranking me second to someone shinier, someone easier, someone who fit better into the narrative my family had been writing since before I could read, and I stood at the front of that chapel with my hands shaking so badly I had to lock my fingers together just to stay upright, staring at the closed casket, polished wood reflecting the gray light filtering through stained glass windows, and I kept looking back at those heavy wooden doors at the rear of the chapel, kept waiting for them to burst open, kept expecting to see my mother rushing in with her hair messy, and her eyes full of that specific regret that comes from realizing you've made a catastrophic mistake, or my father's stiff formal walk, the one he used when he was uncomfortable but trying to maintain dignity, or even my best friend Marissa slipping into a back pew trying not to make noise but making her presence known, giving me that look that said, "I'm here now. I'm sorry I'm late, but I'm here," except the doors stayed shut, stayed closed, stayed locked against me the same way my family had. Locked me out of their priorities my entire life, and the silence, the suffocating silence broken only by the pastor's voice and the occasional cough from the handful of people who'd actually shown up, Daniel's co-workers, a few neighbors, strangers who had more compassion for my grief than the people who'd known me since birth. That silence screamed at me, mocked me, reminded me with every passing second that I was alone, had always been alone, had just been too hopeful, too naive, too desperate for love to see it clearly until this moment. Daniel had been my anchor since I was 22, 9 years of marriage, 9 years of being chosen first, of being prioritized, of being loved without having to earn it, without having to perform, without having to shrink myself to make room for someone else's spotlight. And now he was gone, car accident, sudden, brutal, the kind of thing that happens to other people in other stories, except this time it happened to us. Happened to me, took away the one person who'd made me feel like I mattered, like I was enough, like I didn't need to apologize for existing. And as I stood there listening to Pastor Michael talk about Daniel's kindness, his reliability, his consistency, that word kept echoing in my head, showed up. He always showed up for people, the pastor said, and I wanted to scream, wanted to point at the empty pews, wanted to ask where the people who were supposed to show up for me were. Why showing up was a virtue everyone praised, but nobody actually practiced when it meant choosing me over something more convenient, more celebratory, more aligned with their own desires. The whispers started about 15 minutes into the service. Low murmurs from the back rows where Daniel's co-workers sat. People who barely knew me but had come anyway because they'd respected my husband, because they understood that funerals weren't optional, weren't negotiable, weren't something you skipped because you had a better offer. "Where's her family?" I heard someone whisper, and another voice responded. "Didn't her parents make it?" And someone else, softer, more concerned. "Is she here?" Completely alone, and each whisper felt like a small cut, precise, intentional, not deep enough to kill me, but deep enough to make sure I felt everything, felt the shame, felt the abandonment, felt the weight of being so thoroughly unchosen that even strangers noticed, even people who had no context understood something was wrong, something was missing, something fundamental about family and support and basic human decency had failed here. I tried to focus on Daniel's face in my memory, tried to block out the whispers and the empty seats and the crushing realization of my aloneness, tried to remember his crooked smile, the way his left side lifted slightly higher than his right when he was genuinely happy, the way he'd squeeze my hand twice, quick pulses that meant "I love you" without needing words, the way he defended me to my family every single time they dismissed me, diminished me, made me feel like I was the problem, like I was too sensitive, like I was imagining the favoritism, the hierarchy, the constant message that I was fine but my sister Emma was special, I was capable but Emma was extraordinary, I was loved, but Emma was adored, and Daniel had seen it, had named it, had refused to participate in it. Had actually stood up in the middle of a Christmas dinner 3 years ago and told my parents that their treatment of me was cruel, was obvious, was something they should be ashamed of, and my mother had cried, had made herself the victim, had turned Daniel's defense of me into an attack on her, and my father had asked us to leave, had said Daniel was disrespectful, had suggested that maybe we needed to reconsider whether we were really part of this family, if we couldn't be grateful for everything they'd done, and we'd left, had spent Christmas alone, and Daniel had held me while I sobbed, and said, "I'm your family now. You don't need them." Except I'd still hoped, had still believed that someday they'd see me, would choose me, would realize that I mattered too, and that hope, that stupid, desperate hope, was dying along with my husband, was being buried in the same grave, was turning to ash in my chest as I stood there understanding that they'd made their choice, had made it definitively, had chosen a party over a funeral, champagne over grief, my sister's happiness over my devastation. But anger kept pushing its way in, uninvited and sharp, cutting through the grief like a knife, because I knew exactly where my family was, knew with perfect clarity what they were doing while I stood here watching my husband's casket. They were at the Riverside Country Club, the fancy one with the golf course and the yacht club privileges. They were in the main ballroom with its crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water. They were celebrating Emma's engagement to Marcus Wellington, whose family owned half the commercial real estate in our county, Marcus, whose last name opened doors, whose connections mattered, whose proposal had been exactly the kind of social event my parents lived for, the kind they could brag about, the kind they could use to elevate their own status. And Emma was there right now, this exact moment, showing off her ring, a massive princess-cut diamond that probably cost more than Daniel and I had spent on our entire wedding. She was laughing, was posing for photos, was basking in attention and approval and unconditional celebration, and my parents were beside her. My mother in whatever expensive dress she'd bought specifically for this occasion. My father glad-handing Marcus's family, networking, performing, playing the role of proud father of the bride-to-be, and they were all acting like the world hadn't just ended for me, like my grief was optional, like my husband's death was unfortunate timing but not important enough to disrupt their plans, their celebration, their moment. Even Marissa, my best friend since college, the one who'd been my maid of honor, who'd promised at my wedding that she'd always be there, that nothing would ever come between us, that our friendship was forever. Even she had chosen the engagement party, had sent me a text 3 days before the funeral, a text I'd read so many times I had it memorized. "Jess, I'm so sorry, but I can't miss Emma's party. My parents are going and they'd be furious if I didn't show. You understand, right? You know I love you. We'll do something to remember Daniel next week, I promise." And I'd stared at that text, at the casual cruelty of it, at the assumption that my understanding was guaranteed, that my grief could be scheduled around convenience, that remembering my husband was something that could be postponed, rescheduled, fit in when it was less disruptive, and I'd wanted to respond, wanted to say something cutting, something that would make her feel even a fraction of what I was feeling, but I'd just put the phone down, had added her name to the growing list of people who'd proven that when it mattered, when the choice was hard, when showing up for me meant sacrificing something else, they would always choose the something else. The service continued. Hymns I didn't hear, prayers I didn't process, eulogies from Daniel's brother and his best friend from college, people who'd flown in from other states, who'd rearranged work schedules, who'd made the effort because they understood that death doesn't wait, grief doesn't accommodate, funerals aren't flexible, and the contrast was killing me, was highlighting exactly how little my own family valued me, exactly how low I ranked in their priorities, exactly how expendable I was in comparison to Emma, to appearances, to maintaining their perfect family image that only worked if I stayed quiet, stayed small, stayed grateful for scraps of attention they threw my way when it was convenient, when it didn't cost them anything, when it didn't conflict with something more important. Have you ever been in a room full of people and felt completely alone? Have you ever stood at the lowest point of your life and looked around for the faces that should be there, that promised to be there, and seen only strangers and empty chairs? Let me know where you're watching this from, because I need to know someone understands this. Someone has felt this particular brand of abandonment, this specific flavor of betrayal that comes from blood family, from people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, but whose love is actually the most conditional thing you've ever experienced. Type alone if you've been there, type abandoned if you know what I'm talking about, because what happened next, what I'm about to tell you, only makes sense if you understand that I'd reached a breaking point, that something fundamental had shifted, that the girl who'd spent her whole life trying to earn her family's love had died somewhere, between the phone call telling me Daniel was gone, and the moment I realized no one was coming to help me bury him. When the time came to lower the casket, to actually put Daniel in the ground, the sky seemed to darken even though it was only 2 in the afternoon, or maybe that was just my vision blurring, my legs weakening, my entire body rebelling against what was happening. I stepped closer to the grave, heard the soft mechanical sound of the pulley system, watched the ropes tighten and the casket begin its descent into the earth, into the hole that would be Daniel's final resting place. And that was the moment. That exact moment when the casket disappeared from view, when I understood with terrible clarity that he was really gone, that I would never hear his voice again, never feel his hand squeeze mine twice, never have anyone choose me first. That was when something inside me cracked open completely, not gently, not gradually, but all at once, like ice breaking under pressure, like a dam failing, like a structure that had been holding together through sheer force of will finally collapsing. Because the will was gone, because the reason to hold together had just been buried 6 feet under. And then my phone lit up, the screen glowing in my pocket, vibrating against my leg, and I pulled it out with numb fingers, expecting maybe a condolence message from someone who couldn't make it, maybe a coworker checking in, maybe nothing important, but what I saw made my blood turn to ice, made my hands start shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. It was a text from my mother, just 4 words. "We need to talk now." And I stared at those words, at the entitlement of them, at the audacity, at the absolute nerve of my mother deciding that now, this exact moment, while dirt was being thrown onto my husband's casket, while I was standing at a graveside barely holding myself together, now she needed to talk, now she had something urgent to say, now she wanted my attention, and I looked at my call log, saw the missed calls stacking up, 36 missed calls, the screen showed 36, and I started scrolling. Started seeing the pattern. My mother, my father, my mother again, Emma, Marissa, my mother 3 more times, my father twice, on and on. 36 calls while I'd been burying my husband, while I'd been experiencing the worst moment of my life, while I'd been standing alone in front of a casket understanding that I'd been abandoned by everyone who claimed to love me. They'd been calling, had been trying to reach me, not to apologize, not to say they were coming, not to offer support, but because they needed something, wanted something, required something from me. And the timing, the cruel, horrible timing of it, made something in me that had been holding back, that had been trying to be understanding, that had been making excuses for them, that something snapped completely, broke irreparably, died permanently. My hands felt numb as I stared at the screen, my heart pounding not with hope but with a bitter, hollow rage, the kind that's cold rather than hot, the kind that calcifies rather than burns, the kind that doesn't make you scream but makes you go quiet, makes you go still, makes you start calculating rather than feeling. And I understood then, understood with perfect clarity, that whatever my mother wanted to talk about, whatever crisis or emergency or situation had generated 36 phone calls, it wasn't about me, wasn't about supporting me, wasn't about acknowledging that they'd abandoned me at my lowest point. It was about them, about their needs, about whatever consequence or fallout or social embarrassment had resulted from their choice to skip their daughter's husband's funeral for a party, and they wanted me to manage it, to smooth it over, to make it okay, to absolve them, to tell them I understood, to perform forgiveness I didn't feel, to go back to being the easy daughter, the understanding daughter, the one who didn't make waves, who didn't cause problems, who accepted being second choice, third choice, last choice, no choice at all. I could almost hear my mother's voice in my head, already defensive. I didn't go home after the funeral, couldn't make myself drive to the house I'd shared with Daniel, the house where his shoes were still by the door, where his coffee mug was probably still in the sink from the morning he'd left and never came back, where everything would smell like him, like us, like the life we'd built that had just been destroyed. So I sat in my car with my forehead resting against the steering wheel. The parking lot of the cemetery slowly emptying as people left. As Daniel's coworkers gave me final hugs and murmured condolences and promises to check in that some would keep and some wouldn't. As Pastor Michael squeezed my shoulder and told me the church was here for me if I needed anything. as the funeral director handed me paperwork in a black folder and explained what would happen next with the grave marker, the death certificates, all the administrative cruelty that follows death, all the forms and fees and official acknowledgments that someone you loved no longer exists, and I nodded, signed things, accepted the folder, smiled tightly, performed functionality while inside I was screaming, was breaking, was trying to understand how I could feel both completely numb and in excruciating pain at the same time, how I could be so empty and so full of rage simultaneously, how I could be alone in a parking lot but feel like I was being crushed by the weight of everyone who should have been here and wasn't. My phone kept vibrating in the cup holder, the screen lighting up again and again, my mother's name appearing, disappearing, appearing again. 36 missed calls turned into 40, then 45, then 50, and then the messages started coming in waves, not just from my mother but from my father, from Emma, even from Marissa, all of them saying different versions of the same thing. Please call us back. This isn't what you think. We need to explain. You're misunderstanding the situation. We didn't know it would hurt you this much. And I laughed when I read that last one. Actually laughed out loud. A broken, humorless sound that startled me because I didn't recognize it as coming from my own throat. Didn't know I could make that sound. That bitter bark of disbelief. They didn't know it would hurt me this much. Didn't know that skipping my husband's funeral would hurt. Didn't anticipate that choosing a party over the burial of my partner would cause pain. Didn't realize that abandoning me at the worst moment of my life would have consequences. And the absurdity of it. The sheer audacity of claiming ignorance, of pretending that hurt was unpredictable, that devastation was surprising. It made something in my chest feel like it was being squeezed, like I couldn't get enough air, like the car was too small, too confined, too full of phones and messages and demands for my attention, my understanding, my forgiveness, my absolution of their cruelty. I finally drove home when the cemetery staff started closing the gates, when staying longer meant making someone wait, meant causing inconvenience. And even in my grief, I couldn't shake the training of a lifetime, the programming that said don't be difficult, don't cause problems, don't make people uncomfortable. And I hated that about myself, hated that even now, even after everything. I was still performing consideration for strangers, while my own family had shown me none. The drive home was mechanical, automatic, muscle memory taking me through turns and stops I'd made thousands of times, past the coffee shop where Daniel and I had our first date, past the park where he'd proposed, past the grocery store where we'd argued last week about what kind of pasta to buy, stupid, meaningless argument that I would give anything to have again, would give anything to fight about pastas, about dishes, about whose turn it was to take out the trash, would give anything for the mundane, beautiful, ordinary problems of a marriage that still existed, but those problems were gone, were buried with Daniel, and all I had now were new problems, harder problems, problems shaped like family members who'd shown me exactly where I ranked in their hierarchy of importance, and the ranking was dead last, was afterthought, was not at all when something better presented itself. The house felt wrong the moment I opened the door, felt empty in a way it never had before, even when Daniel was at work, even when I was alone. The space had always felt like ours, like he was coming back, like his presence was just temporarily absent, but now the absence was permanent, was final, was a void that couldn't be filled, and I stood in the entryway staring at his shoes. Brown leather loafers he'd kicked off carelessly, one on its side, and I couldn't move, couldn't step past them, couldn't accept that those shoes would never be worn again, that he'd never bend down to tie them, never complain that they were getting old and he needed new ones, never leave them exactly there for me to trip over. I collapsed onto the couch, still wearing my funeral clothes, black dress that I'd bought specifically for this, that I'd never wear again, that would go in the trash because how do you keep funeral clothes? How do you hang them in your closet like they're normal, like they're just another outfit, like they weren't the costume you wore to the worst day of your life? And sitting there, surrounded by Daniel's things, I finally looked at my mother's messages, finally opened them, finally read what was so urgent it couldn't wait until after her daughter buried her husband. The first message said, "Jessica, we need to talk immediately. This is important." Followed by, "I don't understand why you're not answering." Followed by, "Your father and I are very concerned." Followed by, "Emma is upset, and we need to discuss this as a family." And I stared at that word, family, stared at it until it stopped looking like a word and started looking like a weapon, like something that had been used against me my entire life. A word that meant you owe us, you need to understand, you don't. get to have boundaries. You don't get to be hurt by our choices because family, because blood, because we raised you. And I kept scrolling, kept reading. My father's messages were shorter, more authoritative. Call your mother now. This behavior is unacceptable. You're being childish and we need to address it. And Emma's messages were the most revealing, were honest in a way the others weren't. Everyone is asking where you are. You're embarrassing mom and dad. You're making my engagement about you. Why can't you just be happy for me? And there it was. There was the truth under all the concern and worry and urgent demands. I was embarrassing them. My grief was inconvenient. My husband's death was poorly timed. My absence from the engagement party had been noted, had been commented on, had raised questions they didn't want to answer, and my pain, my devastation, my complete emotional collapse. All of that mattered less than the social awkwardness of explaining why the bride-to-be's sister wasn't there to celebrate. Marissa's messages were different, were wrapped in friendship language, in apologies that weren't really apologies. Jess, I'm so sorry I couldn't be there. I know you understand. Family obligations are complicated. I feel terrible. Please don't be mad. We can talk about Daniel whenever you're ready. I'm here for you. And that last line, I'm here for you, it would have been funny if it wasn't so painful, because where had she been? Where was here? Apparently here was the country club, was the engagement party, was wherever was convenient, wherever didn't require sacrifice, wherever didn't conflict with her own comfort, her own plans, her own desire to avoid difficult conversations, difficult emotions, difficult presence with someone else's grief. And I realized something then, realized that Marissa had never actually been there for me in any meaningful way, had been there for brunch, for shopping, for gossip, for fun, but the moment things got hard, the moment presence required something from her, she disappeared, made excuses, promised to show up later when it was easier. Except grief doesn't get easier, loss doesn't become more convenient, death doesn't wait for a better time, and her absence wasn't about scheduling, wasn't about family obligations, was about choice, was about deciding that my pain wasn't worth her discomfort, that my loss wasn't worth her awkward conversation with her parents about why she was missing the party, that my husband's funeral wasn't worth the social capital she'd lose by not being where everyone else was. I typed out a response and deleted it at least 10 times, tried to find words that would convey what I was feeling, tried to articulate the betrayal, the abandonment, the soul-crushing realization that the people I'd counted on had failed me completely, catastrophically, in the exact moment I needed them most. But every version sounded either too angry or too hurt or too desperate, and I didn't want to give them my anger, didn't want to give them my hurt, didn't want to perform emotions they'd just invalidate, just explain away, just reframe as overreaction, as taking things too personally, as making everything about me. So I settled on something simple, something final, something that couldn't be argued with or negotiated or turned into a discussion. You chose a party over my husband's funeral. There is nothing left to explain. And I sent it to all of them, my mother, my father, Emma, Marissa, the same message to everyone because they'd all made the same choice, had all decided collectively that Emma's engagement mattered more than Daniel's death, that celebration was more important than grief, that champagne and cake and photographs were worth more than supporting a daughter, a sister, a friend who was burying her husband, and hitting send felt like closing a door, like drawing a line, like saying this is where I stop understanding, where I stop making excuses, where I stop pretending that this is normal family dysfunction and start calling it what it is, which is cruelty, which is abandonment, which is the systematic devaluation of one person to elevate another. Within seconds, my phone rang, my mother's name lighting up the screen, and I stared at it, watched it ring, listened to the aggressive buzz of it demanding my attention, demanding my time, demanding that I pick up and listen and understand and forgive. And I didn't answer, let it ring until it stopped, until it went to voicemail, until the silence came back. And then it rang again, and again I didn't answer. And this happened 5 times. 6 times, 7 times, my mother calling me, watching, the phone eventually going quiet, the pattern repeating, and each time I didn't answer felt like practice, like learning a new skill, like discovering that I could simply not respond, could simply not engage, could simply let their demands go unanswered, and the world wouldn't end, I wouldn't die, lightning wouldn't strike, I would just sit here in my grief with my boundaries, and that would be okay, would be necessary, would be the beginning of something I should have done years ago. The next morning I woke up on the couch, still in my funeral clothes, neck aching, eyes swollen. The sun coming through windows I'd forgotten to close, and for a split second I forgot Forgot everything. Forgot that Daniel was dead. Forgot that my family had abandoned me. Forgot that everything had changed. And then reality crashed back in, heavy and suffocating, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't process that this was my life now, that I had to figure out how to exist in a world without Daniel, without family, without the structures I'd built my identity around. And I was lying there trying to remember how to inhale when someone knocked on the door, loud, insistent, the kind of knocking that said, "I'm not leaving, I know you're in there, you need to answer." And I knew without looking who it was, knew that my message hadn't been enough, that simple boundaries weren't sufficient, that they decided to show up, to force a conversation, to make me listen, to make me understand their perspective, to make me forgive. And I was right. I looked through the peephole and saw Emma standing on my porch, still wearing her engagement ring, the diamond catching morning light and throwing little rainbows across her hand, and she looked upset, makeup smudged, hair less perfect than usual, clearly crying or about to cry, clearly here to make this about her, to make my grief about her discomfort, to make Daniel's death about her engagement. And I almost didn't open the door, almost let her stand there knocking, but curiosity won. Anger won. The need to hear what possible justification she'd come up with won. So I opened the door, and before I could speak, she pushed past me into my house, into my space, into the sanctuary where Daniel's presence still lingered, and she started talking, started crying, started performing emotion designed to manipulate, designed to make me comfort her, designed to turn her into the victim of a situation where I'd buried my husband alone. Emma stood in my living room gesturing dramatically with her ring hand, whether consciously or unconsciously I couldn't tell, tears streaming down her face, smudging her makeup in a way that probably looked artistic, looked vulnerable, looked like the kind of crying that gets sympathy rather than judgment. And she said, "Jessica, I never meant for things to turn out this way. I never wanted you to be hurt. I thought you'd understand. I thought you'd want me to be happy. I thought Daniel would have wanted the family to be together, would have wanted us to celebrate life, would have understood that the party had been planned for months, that people had flown in, that we couldn't cancel, couldn't disappoint everyone, couldn't make Marcus's family think we were the kind of people who didn't honor commitments." And she kept talking, kept explaining, kept justifying, kept making excuses that all boiled down to the same thing. Her engagement was more important than my husband's funeral. Her happiness was more important than my grief. Her event was more valuable than my loss. And I listened, stood there in my wrinkled funeral clothes listening to my sister explain why she'd abandoned me, and something inside me shifted, hardened, crystallized into clarity. I waited until she stopped talking, until she ran out of words, and just stood there looking at me with wet eyes, expecting comfort, expecting understanding, expecting me to say it's okay. I get it. I'm not mad. Expecting me to perform the role I'd always performed, the understanding sister, the one who didn't make waves, who didn't have needs, who didn't demand to be prioritized. And instead I said, "Emma, you need to leave." My voice calm, flat, empty of emotion, because if I let the emotion in, I'd scream, I'd break, I'd say things I couldn't unsay. And she blinked, confused, clearly not expecting this, clearly expecting tears and hugs and reconciliation. "But we need to talk about this," she said. "We're sisters, we're family. We can't just—" "Yes, we can," I interrupted. "We can absolutely just not do this. You made your choice. You chose your party over my husband's funeral. You chose champagne over supporting me at the worst moment of my life. And that choice has consequences. The consequence is that you don't get to be here, don't get to cry in my living room, don't get to explain and justify and make this okay. Because it's not okay. It will never be okay. And I don't want to hear why you think it should be." And her face changed then, shifted from tears to something harder, something more honest, and she said what she really thought, what had been underneath all the apologies and explanations. "You're being selfish," she said, her voice sharp now, angry. "You're making everything about your grief, about your loss. Life doesn't stop just because you lost someone, Jessica. The world keeps turning, people keep celebrating, and you can't expect everyone to put their lives on hold because you're sad. It's been one day, and you're already trying to make this into some big betrayal, when really you're just upset that for once you weren't the center of attention, that for once something was about me instead of about you and your perfect marriage and your perfect husband, who everyone always liked better than Marcus anyway." There it was, the truth, the real reason, the core of it, She was jealous, had been jealous, had resented that people liked Daniel, that people thought our marriage was healthy, that people compared her flashy engagement to Marcus Wellington. Marcus, whose family had money but who everyone knew was kind of an asshole, who everyone tolerated because of his name, his connections, his ability to open doors, to Marcus, who nobody actually liked but everyone pretended to respect, and Daniel, who had nothing except character, except kindness, except genuine warmth. People had liked him, had respected him, had chosen to spend time with him even though he couldn't advance their careers, couldn't get them into exclusive clubs, couldn't offer anything except his presence, his attention, his care, and Emma hated that, had hated that I'd chosen better, had found better, had built better, even though I was the spare daughter, the backup, the one who wasn't supposed to shine. And now that Daniel was dead, now that my marriage was destroyed, she wanted me to get over it quickly, wanted me to move on, wanted me to go back to being the supporting actress in her life rather than the grieving widow who was making her engagement uncomfortable, who was casting a shadow over her celebration, who was reminding people that life isn't always parties and rings and social climbing. Sometimes it's loss, sometimes it's pain, sometimes it's standing at a grave alone because the people who should love you chose better lighting for their Instagram photos. Those words, the selfish accusation, the dismissal of my grief as attention-seeking, the suggestion that one day was enough time to process my husband's death. Those words hurt more than I expected, cut deeper than I thought possible, but they also freed me, liberated me, gave me permission to do what I should have done years ago, gave me clarity about who Emma really was, not my little sister who needed protection, not the golden child who'd been given unfair advantages but was basically good. Underneath, no. She was someone who benefited from my silence, who needed me to stay small so she could stay elevated, who required my understanding so she could avoid accountability, who depended on my forgiveness so she could keep hurting me without consequences. And I was done protecting her, done making excuses for her, done pretending that her treatment of me was sisterly, was normal, was something I needed to accept because family. And I looked at her standing in my living room in the house I'd shared with Daniel, wearing her engagement ring like armor, and I said the truest thing I'd said in years. Get out, I said, my voice quiet but absolute. Get out of my house. Get out of my life. You don't get to speak for my husband. You didn't know him, didn't value him, didn't show up when he died. You don't get to tell me what he would have wanted. And you don't get to call me selfish for grieving, for being devastated, for expecting basic human decency from people who claim to love me. You're right about one thing though. Life does keep going. Celebrations do continue, but you know what else keeps going? Consequences, boundaries, the understanding that some choices can't be undone, some words can't be taken back, some relationships can't be repaired, and this is one of them. You abandoned me, you chose a party over a funeral, you called my grief selfish, and now you get to live with that. Get to live with the knowledge that you had a sister, and you lost her, not because she died, but because you couldn't be bothered to show up when it mattered. Now get out. And don't come back. Emma's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if the moment wasn't so devastating. Shock first, her eyes widening like she couldn't believe I was actually telling her to leave. Couldn't process that the sister who'd always backed down, always apologized, always made herself smaller to accommodate Emma's needs, was suddenly standing firm, was suddenly saying no, was suddenly drawing a boundary that felt like a wall. Then came anger. Her jaw clenching, her hands curling into fists, the diamond on her finger catching light like a weapon, and finally something that looked almost like fear, like she was realizing that this wasn't a fight she could win, wasn't a situation she could manipulate her way out of, wasn't a moment where tears and accusations would make me fold, would make me take it back, would make me say I didn't mean it, that we could work it out, that family was forever. But I did mean it. Meant it more than I'd meant almost anything meant. It with every cell in my body that was screaming for her to leave, to take her ring and her excuses and her victimhood and get out of the space where Daniel had lived, where his memory still existed, where her presence felt like contamination, like she was infecting the last place that was mine, that was ours, that was sacred. She opened her mouth to argue. I could see it forming, could see her gearing up for another performance, another round of tears and manipulation, but something in my face must have stopped her, must have communicated that I was done, that there was no more road here, no more patience, No more understanding, no more chances. Just the door and the expectation that she'd walk through it, and she did, finally. After a long moment of staring at me like I was a stranger, like she'd never seen me before, like the sister she knew had been replaced by someone harder, someone who wouldn't bend, someone who'd finally broken in a way that made her dangerous instead of manageable. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking on my hardwood floor, the sound getting fainter until the door opened and closed and she was gone. And I stood there in the sudden silence feeling like I'd just survived something, feeling like I'd just won something, feeling like I'd just lost something too, except what I'd lost wasn't worth keeping, was actually poison, was actually killing me slowly. And cutting it out hurt, but the hurt was necessary, was healing, was the kind of pain that comes before recovery rather than before death. I locked the door behind her, turned the deadbolt, put the chain on, symbolic gestures that wouldn't actually keep them out if they really wanted in but made me feel safer, made me feel like I had control over something, over my space if not over my grief, over my boundaries if not over my family, and I walked back to the couch, sat down in the indent I'd made last night, picked up my phone and saw 17 new messages. My parents had joined the conversation, had escalated from concerned to angry to demanding. My father's messages getting progressively shorter and more authoritative. Call me immediately. This is unacceptable. You will respect your mother. We raised you better than this. That last one almost made me laugh again. That broken, bitter sound. Because if this was better, if treating my grief as less important than a party was better, if abandoning me at a funeral was better, then I didn't want better, didn't want whatever values they'd tried to instill, didn't want the version of family they'd modeled, where love was conditional, where support was optional, where hierarchy mattered more than need, where the golden child got everything and the spare child got the scraps and was supposed to be grateful for them. My mother's messages were longer, more manipulative, more designed to make me feel guilty. Jessica, I don't understand what's happening. We've always been a close family. I've always tried to be a good mother. I don't know where this anger is coming from. Your sister is devastated. She came home crying. You've hurt her deeply. She just wanted to make sure you were okay, wanted to be there for you. And you threw her out. I'm very disappointed in your behavior. Grief is not an excuse for cruelty. Daniel wouldn't want you to be like this. Wouldn't want you to push your family away. He always valued family, always tried to bring us together, and using his name, invoking Daniel like she knew him, like she'd valued him, like she had any right to speak for what he would have wanted when she couldn't be bothered to attend his funeral. That felt like desecration, felt like she was spitting on his grave. And the rage that rose in me was hot now, was burning, was the kind that makes you shake, that makes your vision narrow, that makes you want to destroy something, break something, scream until your throat bleeds. But I didn't scream, didn't break, didn't destroy, just sat there letting the rage move through me, letting it inform me, letting it teach me something about what I would and wouldn't tolerate, what I could and couldn't accept, what I deserved and what I'd been accepting instead. I called my father, didn't text, didn't message, called because I wanted him to hear my voice, wanted him to understand that I was calm, was rational, was making conscious choices rather than emotional reactions, and he picked up on the first ring. Jessica, his voice was hard, was the voice he used when he was about to deliver a lecture, when he was about to tell me everything I'd done wrong and how I needed to fix it. We need to discuss your behavior. Your mother is very upset, your sister is hurt. This situation has gotten completely out of hand, and I interrupted him, something I'd never done, never had the courage to do, never felt I had the right to do. Dad, I said, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking, I'm going to say this once, and then I'm going to hang up. You and Mom chose to go to Emma's engagement party instead of Daniel's funeral. That was your choice. You made it consciously. You made it knowing what it would mean, what it would cost, how it would affect me. And now you have to live with the consequences of that choice. The consequence is that I don't want to talk to you, don't want to see you, don't want to hear your excuses or your justifications or your explanations for why a party was more important than supporting your daughter while she buried her husband. You don't get to make that choice and then demand that I understand, that I forgive, that I pretend it didn't happen, that I go back to being the easy daughter who doesn't cause problems. He tried to interrupt, tried to talk over me, but I kept going, my voice getting stronger, getting louder. Jessica, that's not fair. We didn't listen to me, I said, and something in my tone made him stop, made him actually listen. You spent my entire childhood making it clear that Emma was more important, was more valuable, was more deserving of attention, time, resources, love, and I accepted it. I made myself small. I made myself understanding. I made myself easy to overlook because I thought that's what family was. I thought that's what love looked like. I thought if I just tried hard enough, if I just understood enough, if I just asked for less and less and less, eventually you'd see me, you'd value me, you'd choose me, but you never did, you never will, and I'm done waiting for it, done hoping for it, done pretending that your treatment of me is normal, is acceptable, is something I have to tolerate because we share DNA. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave me alone. You're going to stop calling, stop texting, stop showing up, stop demanding that I engage with people who've proven they don't actually care about me beyond how useful I am, how understanding I am, how little space I take up. And if you can't do that, if you can't respect that boundary, then I'll make it legal. I'll get restraining orders. I'll do whatever I need to do to protect myself from people who hurt me and then get angry that I'm hurt. Do you understand me? The silence on the other end of the phone was total, was absolute, was the kind of quiet that happens when someone's entire worldview is being challenged, when the script they've been following suddenly doesn't work anymore, when the person who is supposed to be manageable becomes unmanageable, and I could almost hear him trying to formulate a response, trying to find the words that would put me back in my place, that would remind me of my role, that would make me apologize for setting boundaries, for demanding respect, for refusing to accept treatment that was destroying me. And when he finally spoke, his voice was different, was uncertain, was the voice of someone who just realized they'd lost control. Jessica, you're being unreasonable. Grief has clearly... I hung up, didn't let him finish, didn't give him the opportunity to blame my grief, to pathologize my boundaries, to make my completely rational response to their abandonment into evidence of instability. Just ended the call, blocked his number, blocked my mother's number, blocked Emma's number, blocked Marissa's number, systematically cutting off every avenue they had to reach me, to demand things from me, to make me feel guilty for protecting myself. And each block felt like freedom, felt like reclaiming something, felt like saying my peace is more important than your comfort, my healing is more important than your convenience, my survival is more important than your image, and that prioritization, that radical act of choosing myself, it felt revolutionary, felt like I was finally doing something I should have done years ago, something Daniel had begged me to do, something I'd been too afraid to do, because I thought losing them would mean losing everything, but I'd already lost everything, had lost it when Daniel died, had lost it when they chose not to show up, had lost it somewhere in my childhood when I'd internalized that my worth was measured by how little I asked for, and realizing I had nothing left to lose was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. I need to pause here because I need to know if anyone watching this has ever had to choose between family and sanity, between keeping the peace and keeping yourself. Type chose myself if you've been there. Type still choosing if you're in the middle of it right now, because what I'm about to tell you, what happened over the next few weeks, it only makes sense if you understand that cutting off your family isn't clean, isn't simple, isn't like closing a door and never thinking about it again. It's messy, it's complicated, it's a daily choice to maintain boundaries against people who think they have unlimited access to you because of biology, because of history, because of their own needs, and from our stats, we've got way more viewers than subscribers. If you're following this story, if you need to see how someone survives complete abandonment and comes out stronger, kindly join our community and hit that subscribe button, because the next few weeks tested everything I thought I knew. About strength, about family, about what it means to choose yourself when everyone around you is telling you that choosing yourself is selfish, is wrong, is something you should be ashamed of, and I need you to see how this ends. Need you to understand that surviving family trauma is possible, is necessary, is the beginning of actual life rather than the end of it. Days turned into weeks, and the silence was both peaceful and terrifying. Peaceful because I wasn't being bombarded with messages, with calls, with demands for my attention, my forgiveness, my participation in a family dynamic that had always hurt me, but terrifying because silence meant isolation, meant facing grief without distraction, meant sitting with the reality that I'd lost my husband and cut off my family in the same week, meant understanding that I was truly alone in a way I'd never been before, and the alone part, the complete solitude, it was harder than I'd expected, was heavier than I'd anticipated, made me question sometimes in the middle of the night whether I'd made the right choice, whether I'd overreacted, whether I should reach out, apologize, try to fix it. But then I'd remember the funeral, remember standing alone while they toasted champagne, remember Emma calling my grief selfish, remember my mother using Daniel's name to manipulate me, and the anger would come back, would remind me that I hadn't overreacted, had actually underreacted for most of my life, had spent 3 decades accepting treatment that no one should accept, and cutting them off wasn't cruelty, wasn't punishment, was self-preservation, was survival, was the absolute minimum I owed myself after years of putting their comfort ahead of my needs. I started going through Daniel's things because I had to, because the house was full of him, because every room held memories that made me cry, made me smile, made me feel like he was still here somehow, still present, still mine even though he was gone. I found notes he'd hidden for me, little pieces of paper tucked into books with messages like "You're beautiful today, even though you don't think so," or "I love you more than coffee, and you know that's saying something," or "Remember that you're stronger than whatever's trying to break you." And that last one, I found it in a cookbook he'd given me 2 Christmases ago. Found it on a Tuesday afternoon when I was trying to decide what to eat, trying to remember how to take care of myself. And I stood in the kitchen crying, holding this note, understanding that Daniel had believed in my strength even when I didn't, had seen something in me that I'd never seen in myself, had known somehow that I'd need these messages, would need proof that I'd been loved deeply, completely, without conditions, without reservations, without the requirement that I be easy, that I be understanding, that I be less. And his love, even in absence, even in death, was more real than my family's love had ever been, was teaching me what love actually looked like, what it actually required, what it actually gave. Work became both a refuge and a challenge. People treated me gently, spoke softly around me like I might break, gave me space when I needed it, checked in when I seemed to be struggling, and the kindness, the genuine concern from colleagues who barely knew me, it highlighted how absent that concern had been from the people who'd known me my whole life. My boss told me to take whatever time I needed, said the job would be here when I was ready, said grief doesn't have a timeline, and I cried in her office because someone was giving me permission to fall apart, was acknowledging that healing takes time, that you don't just get over losing your person, that showing up for work doesn't mean you're okay, and that permission, that recognition, it was more than my own mother had given me, more than my family had offered, more than the people who claimed to love me had been willing to provide, and the contrast, the stark difference between how strangers treated me versus how family treated me, it taught me something important about where love actually lives, where care actually happens, where support actually exists, and it's not always where you expect it, not always where biology says it should be. Sometimes love is the coworker who brings you coffee without asking, the neighbor who mows your lawn because they know you can't, the stranger at the grocery store who sees you crying in the cereal aisle and asks if you're okay. And sometimes family is just people who share your genes but not your values, your pain, your life. My mother tried once more to reach me, sent a letter because I'd blocked her number, blocked her email, blocked every digital avenue, and the letter arrived 3 weeks after the funeral, cream-colored envelope with her perfect handwriting, my name and address written in the careful script she'd learned at finishing school, and I almost didn't open it, almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won, anger won, the need to see what she'd say, what excuse she'd formulated, what manipulation she'd crafted one, and I opened it standing by my mailbox. Read it right there in the afternoon sun, and the letter said everything and nothing, said she was sorry I was hurting, sorry I felt abandoned, sorry I'd taken things so personally, said she'd hoped we could move past this someday, hoped I'd understand when I'd had time to process, hoped I'd forgive her because that's what family does, family forgives, family moves on, family doesn't hold grudges, and reading those words, that carefully constructed non-apology that blamed my interpretation rather than her actions, that suggested time would make me more reasonable, that implied forgiveness was something I owed her, something family required. I felt nothing, felt the absence of emotion, felt the vast empty space where anger used to be, where hurt used to live, where hope used to exist, and that nothing, that emotional void, it wasn't numbness, wasn't depression, was something else entirely, was the sound of a door closing, was the feeling of a bridge burning, was the moment when you realize you've already moved on, have already left, have already survived the thing you thought would kill you. I texted back one sentence, didn't call, didn't write a letter, just sent the words I need space and I'm choosing myself now, and then I blocked the number I'd sent it from, turned off my phone, sat in my living room that was slowly becoming just my space rather than our space, Daniel's and mine. Sat there understanding that forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation, that healing didn't require reopening wounds, that I could acknowledge they were my family and still choose not to have them in my life. could recognize that they did their best, and also recognize that their best wasn't good enough, wasn't safe, wasn't what I needed or deserved, and choosing myself, prioritizing my own healing over their comfort, over their desire for things to go back to normal, over their need for me to forgive, so they could stop feeling guilty. That wasn't selfish like Emma had said. That was necessary, was the foundation everything else would be built on, was the beginning of a life where I didn't have to earn love, didn't have to prove worth, didn't have to make myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. And that beginning, that first tentative step toward a life that was actually mine, it felt like betrayal and freedom at the same time, felt like loss and gain, felt like ending and beginning, and I sat there in that feeling, in that complexity, in that truth, and I let it be complicated, let it be hard, let it be exactly what it was without trying to make it simpler, cleaner, easier. To explain, because life isn't simple, grief isn't clean, healing isn't easy, and pretending otherwise, performing okay when you're broken, that's what had gotten me here in the first place. That's what had made me acceptable to people who only loved me when I was convenient, and I was done being convenient, done being easy, done being the daughter who didn't cause problems. I was ready to be the woman who protected herself, who demanded respect, who walked away from people who couldn't love her right, and that woman, that version of me, she was just being born, was just taking her first breath, was just learning to exist in a world where she mattered, where she came first, where she was enough exactly as she was, broken and healing and choosing herself every single day, even when that choice felt impossible, even when that choice meant being alone, even when that choice required letting go of people she'd loved her entire life. Because some loves are toxic, some families are poison, and surviving them, really surviving them, means learning to live without them, means building something new, something better, something that doesn't hurt. And I was ready to build, was ready to survive, was ready to become whoever I was supposed to be when I wasn't trying to be what they wanted. And that becoming, that transformation, it started here in this living room, on this day, with this choice, and whatever came next, however hard it got, however lonely the journey became, I knew I'd survive it. Knew I'd make it through because I'd already survived the worst thing, had already lost everything, and when you have nothing left to lose, when you've hit the bottom and lived, you realize you're stronger than you ever thought possible, and that strength, that earned, brutal, necessary strength, it changes everything. The quiet that settled over my life in the weeks after I blocked everyone, after I sent that final text about choosing myself, that quiet wasn't the peaceful silence I'd hoped for. It was thick, was heavy, was the kind of quiet that amplifies every thought, every memory, every moment of doubt that creeps in at 3 a.m. when you're lying alone in a bed that used to hold 2 people and now holds just you and your grief and your questions about whether you made the right choice, whether cutting off your entire family over one missed funeral was proportional, whether you were being too harsh, too unforgiving, too willing to burn bridges that couldn't be rebuilt, and I'd lie there in the dark, Daniel's pillow still smelling faintly like him, even though I knew that was impossible, knew the scent should have faded by now, knew I was probably imagining it, holding on to sensory memories that were more wish than reality. And I'd argue with myself, would play out conversations in my head, where I called my mother back, where I forgave them, where I explained that yes, I was hurt, but I understood that life was complicated, that schedules conflicted, that Emma's engagement was important too, and in these imaginary conversations they'd apologize, really apologize, not the sorry you feel that way apologies from the letter, but actual acknowledgement of harm, actual recognition that they'd abandoned me, actual remorse for choosing a party over a funeral, and we'd cry together, and they'd promise to do better, and I'd give them another chance. And the fantasy was appealing, was seductive, because loneliness is a powerful motivator, because grief makes you vulnerable, because when you're broken you want to believe that the people who helped break you can also fix you. Except I knew in the parts of me that were still rational, that were still clear, that were still protecting me, even when I wanted to stop protecting myself. I knew that those imaginary conversations would never happen in reality, knew that going back would mean going back to the same dynamics, the same hierarchy, the same understanding that I was secondary, was backup, was the daughter who existed to support, to understand, to accommodate, and I couldn't do it anymore, couldn't survive it, couldn't keep lighting myself on fire to keep them warm. I started seeing a therapist because my boss insisted, because she noticed I was showing up to work but not actually present, going through motions but not engaging, smiling when expected but the smile never reaching my eyes, and she'd called me into her office on a Tuesday morning, closed the door, sat down across from me, and said, "Jessica, I'm not asking, I'm telling, you need professional help. You need someone who can help you process what you're going through, and I'm going to give you the number of someone I know, someone good, and you're going to call her. And if you don't call her by Friday, I'm going to call her for you and make the appointment myself." And it wasn't mean, wasn't threatening, was the kind of tough love that comes from someone who actually sees you, who actually cares, who understands that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is remove the option to keep hurting alone. And I cried in her office, thanked her, took the number, called that afternoon because I was tired of fighting everything alone, tired of carrying all of this by myself, tired of pretending I was strong enough to survive this without help. Dr. Sarah Chin was maybe 50, wore glasses that made her look both professional and approachable, had an office that smelled like lavender and felt immediately safe. And in our first session, she didn't make me talk about the funeral, didn't push me to explain the family situation, just asked me to tell her about Daniel, to tell her who he was, what I'd lost, what the world looked like before he died. And I talked for 45 minutes straight, barely pausing for breath, telling her about how we'd met at a bookstore, both reaching for the same book, about how he'd let me have it, and then showed up the next day at the same time hoping to see me again, about how he'd made me laugh on our first date by doing terrible impressions of celebrities, about how he'd proposed by hiding the ring in a book because he knew I'd find it eventually, about how he'd defended me to my family even when it made holidays awkward, about how he'd squeezed my hand twice to say I love you, about how he'd left notes hidden in random places for me to find, about how he'd made me feel seen, valued, chosen. And when I finally stopped talking, when I finally ran out of words, Dr. Chin looked at me with kind eyes and said, "That's a real loss. Jessica, that's not something you just get over. That's not something that should be minimized or rushed. You lost your person, your partner, your safety, and anyone who tells you to move on, to get over it, to be less affected, they don't understand what you actually lost." And hearing that validation, that acknowledgement, it broke something open in me, made me cry harder than I'd cried since the funeral, made me realize how much I'd needed someone to simply say, "Yes, this is terrible. Yes, you're allowed to be devastated. Yes, your grief is proportional to your loss." Dr. Chin asked about my family in our third session, asked gently, carefully, giving me permission to not answer if I wasn't ready, but I was ready, was desperate actually to have someone help me understand if what I was feeling was justified, if my response was reasonable, if cutting them off made me as selfish as Emma had said. And I told her everything, told her about the funeral, about the engagement party, about the 36 missed calls, about Emma showing up at my house, about my mother's letter, about the lifetime of feeling secondary, of being compared unfavorably, of watching Emma get everything while I got what was left over. And Dr. Chin listened without interrupting, took notes occasionally, and when I finished she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Jessica, I need you to understand something. What you experienced wasn't just neglect, wasn't just poor parenting. What you experienced was systemic emotional abuse, was a family structure built on scapegoating, where one child is elevated and one is diminished, where love is distributed unequally and the child who receives less is told they're imagining it, are told they're too sensitive, are told they should be grateful for whatever crumbs they get. And you survived that, survived it for 31 years, and the only reason you were able to survive it was because you had Daniel, because you had someone who chose you first, who showed you what unconditional love looked like. And now that he's gone, now that you don't have that buffer, that protection, you're seeing your family clearly for the first time. You're seeing the abuse without the person who helped you cope with it, and that clarity is painful, is devastating, but it's also necessary. It's also the beginning of real healing. And cutting them off wasn't selfish, wasn't cruel, was self-preservation, was you finally protecting yourself the way they should have protected you your entire life, but never did. Hearing the word abuse, hearing it applied to my family, to my childhood, to the dynamics I'd normalized, it felt wrong at first, felt too strong, too dramatic. Abuse was physical, was obvious, was things that left marks, wasn't just preferring one child over another, wasn't just missing a funeral, wasn't just making someone feel less important. Except Dr. Chun explained that abuse comes in forms that don't leave visible scars, comes in patterns of favoritism that teach one child they don't matter, comes in moments of abandonment that happens so regularly you stop expecting support, comes in the systematic devaluation of a person until they believe they're worth less, deserve less, should expect less. And that's what my family had done. Not through one dramatic incident, but through 31 years of small cuts, small dismissals, small moments where I needed them and they weren't there, where I achieved something and they were busy celebrating Emma, where I hurt and they told me to be strong, to understand, to not make things difficult, and each small moment hadn't seemed like abuse, hadn't felt dramatic enough to label, but accumulated, piled up, stacked one on top of another for 3 decades. They'd created a foundation of worthlessness that I'd been building my entire life on, and Daniel had tried to show me that foundation was false, had tried to prove that I deserved better. But I hadn't been able to see it clearly until he was gone, until the funeral, until they chose champagne over grief, and I finally understood that nothing I did would ever be enough to make them choose me, to make them see me, to make them love me the way I deserve to be loved, and that understanding, that terrible clarifying understanding, it was what allowed me to walk away, to choose myself, to stop waiting for people who were never going to arrive. I started attending a grief support group because Dr. Chen suggested it, because she thought being around other people who'd lost spouses would help, would make me feel less alone, would give me community, and I'd been skeptical, had imagined sitting in a circle of sad people crying and sharing tissues and performing grief. But it wasn't like that. The group met in a church basement every Thursday evening. 8 of us, ranging in age from 25 to 73, all of us having lost partners in the last year, and the facilitator, Mark, was a widower himself, had lost his wife to cancer 5 years ago, and he ran the group with this perfect balance of compassion and practicality, letting people cry when they needed to, but also pushing us to be honest, to not perform, to not pretend we were farther along in healing than we actually were. And in my second session, when it was my turn to share, I told them about the funeral, about my family not showing up, and the room went completely silent. And then a woman named Patricia, 68, whose husband had died of a heart attack 6 months ago. She said I had something similar happen. Not exactly the same, but close. My son didn't come to his father's funeral, said he couldn't get off work, said his boss wouldn't give him the time, and I believed him, made excuses for him, told everyone it was okay, that he'd tried, that sometimes work is inflexible. And then 2 days after the funeral, I saw on Facebook that he'd been at a concert that same day, had posted photos, had been less than an hour away and couldn't be bothered to come, and I haven't spoken to him since, and people tell me I'm being too harsh, that I need to forgive, that family is important, and I tell them that family is supposed to be the people who show up, and if they don't show up, they're not family, they're just people I used to know. The validation from Patricia, from the others who nodded, who shared similar stories, who understood that some betrayals are unforgivable, not because you're bitter, but because forgiving would mean accepting treatment that's unacceptable. That validation meant more than any therapy session, meant more than any self-help book, meant more than anything my actual family could have said, because these were people who understood loss, who understood that when you're at your lowest, when you're in the valley of death, the people who don't show up, who choose something else, who prioritize their comfort over your catastrophe, those people reveal who they actually are, reveal what you actually mean to them, reveal that love has limits, has conditions, has boundaries that you've just exceeded, and seeing that clearly, naming it honestly, refusing to make excuses for it, that's not being unforgiving. That's being realistic. That's being honest. That's being someone who finally values themselves enough to walk away from people who don't value them. And the group taught me that, reinforced it, gave me community around it, gave me people who'd made the same choice, who'd survived the same abandonment, who were building lives without the people who'd hurt them most, and thriving, actually thriving, not just surviving, not just getting through, but actually building something beautiful from the ashes of relationships that should have been sacred but turned out to be toxic. One evening about 6 weeks after the funeral, I was going through a box of Daniel's things from his office. His co-workers had packed it up and dropped it off, had been kind enough to do the emotional labor I couldn't handle, and in the bottom of the box I found a journal I didn't know he kept, leather-bound, worn, clearly something he'd been writing in for years, and I hesitated before opening it, wondered if reading it would be an invasion of privacy, if some things should stay private even after death. But I opened it anyway, needed to feel close to him, needed his voice even if it was just on paper, and the entries were sporadic, weren't daily, were moments he'd wanted to remember, thoughts he'd wanted to preserve, and scattered throughout were entries about me, about our relationship, about my family, and one entry from 2 years ago, right after that Christmas, when he'd confronted my parents. It said, "Jessica thinks she's broken, thinks she's too sensitive, thinks her family's treatment of her as normal is something she should accept, but I see what they do to her, see how they dismiss her, how they elevate Emma, how they make her feel like she's never enough, and it kills me to watch someone I love be slowly destroyed by people who claim to love her. I don't know how to help her see it, how to make her understand that she deserves better, that their treatment of her isn't love. It's abuse disguised as family dynamics, and I'm afraid that if something happens to me, if I'm not here to remind her that she's valuable, that she's chosen, that she matters, she'll go back to them, will accept their cruelty because she's been trained her whole life to accept it, and I can't let that happen, can't let them have her. So I'm writing this down if she ever reads this. If something happens and she finds this journal, I need her to know, you're not broken, you're not too sensitive, you're not imagining it, they did hurt you, they do hurt you, and you deserve better. You deserve people who choose you, who show up for you, who value you, and if I'm not here anymore, if something happens, please don't go back to them. Please choose yourself. Please remember that you're enough. You are always enough. They just couldn't see it, and that's their failure, not yours. I sat on the floor of my living room sobbing, holding this journal, holding Daniel's words, his understanding, his protection that extended beyond death, beyond the grave, beyond the moment when his physical presence ended. He'd known, had seen clearly what I'd spent 3 decades trying to deny, and he'd written it down, had preserved it, had left me this message like the notes he used to hide. Except this one wasn't I love you. This one was you're not crazy. What they do to you is real, is wrong, is something you don't have to accept. And reading those words, knowing that Daniel had seen me that clearly, had understood the dynamics that precisely, had been afraid I'd go back, had wanted to protect me even after he was gone. It confirmed everything, validated everything, made me understand that cutting them off wasn't overreacting, wasn't too harsh, wasn't evidence of my brokenness, but evidence of my healing, was me finally listening to someone who'd loved me enough to tell me the truth, even if that truth was hard, even if that truth meant walking away from blood family, even if that truth meant being alone, because being alone was better than being with people who made you feel alone. Being isolated was better than being surrounded by people who couldn't see you. Having no family was better than having family who treated you like you were disposable. And Daniel had known that, had tried to teach me that, and now, reading his words, understanding his fear, seeing his love expressed as protection, as honest naming of abuse, as permission to choose myself, I finally got it, finally understood that grief and growth could happen simultaneously, that losing him had broken me but had also freed me, had created space for me to see clearly, to choose differently, to become someone who didn't accept abuse just because it came from people who shared my genes, and that becoming, that transformation from victim to survivor, from understanding daughter to woman who demanded respect, it was happening, was real, was the beginning of everything Daniel had wanted for me, everything he'd tried to show me, everything he'd hoped I'd become if I ever found the courage to walk away from people who'd never deserved me. I started building a new life. Not consciously at first, not deliberately, just doing the next thing, then the next, small actions that accumulated into something resembling normalcy. I went back to work fully, not just showing up but engaging, participating, volunteering for projects, rebuilding my professional identity separate from grief, separate from family drama, just me doing work I was good at. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with, people from college, from previous jobs, people who'd known me before Daniel, before marriage, before the version of myself I'd become, trying to balance being a wife and being the understanding daughter. And these friends, when I told them what had happened, they weren't surprised. Several said they'd always thought my family was hard on me, always noticed the favoritism, always wondered why I put up with it, and learning that outsiders had seen what I couldn't see, that the abuse had been visible to people who didn't have years of conditioning telling them it was normal, that validation was powerful, was confirming, was another brick in the foundation I was building, brick by brick, day by day, choice by choice, building a life that was actually mine, that reflected my values rather than accommodating someone else's needs, that centered my healing rather than performing okay for people who didn't actually care if I was okay or not. I started running, not because I was athletic, I wasn't, never had been, but because Dr. Chin suggested I needed a physical outlet for grief, for anger, for the energy that came from rebuilding yourself, and at first it was terrible. I could barely run a mile without stopping, without gasping, without feeling like my lungs would explode, but I kept going, kept running, kept pushing, and slowly, painfully, my body adapted, got stronger, could go farther, and there was something metaphorical about it, something that felt like my grief journey, like my healing, starting out barely able to function, barely able to move forward, but doing it anyway, pushing anyway, surviving anyway, and gradually, incrementally, getting stronger, going farther, becoming capable of things that seemed impossible at the beginning. And 3 months after the funeral, I ran 5 miles without stopping, and when I finished I cried because I'd achieved something Daniel would have been proud of, cried because I'd done something hard, something that required consistency and effort, and showing up day after day even when I didn't want to. And that accomplishment, that small victory, it taught me something important, taught me that I could do hard things, could survive hard things, could build strength from pain, could transform grief into growth. And that lesson, that understanding, it changed everything, changed how I saw myself, changed how I saw my future, changed my understanding of what was possible when you stop accepting limitation. Stop listening to people who tell you you're not enough. Stop waiting for permission to become whoever you're capable of becoming. For months after the funeral, on what would have been Daniel's 35th birthday, I woke up, and instead of the crushing grief I'd expected, instead of the paralysis that had marked every other significant date since he died, I felt something different, something lighter. Not happiness exactly, not peace, but a kind of gentle acceptance, a recognition that he was gone, and I was still here, and that being here wasn't betrayal, wasn't dishonoring his memory, was actually the most honest way to honor it. To live, to keep going, to become someone he'd be proud of rather than someone who stayed frozen in the moment of loss. And I decided to do something I'd been avoiding, something that felt too final, too permanent, too much like acceptance. I decided to sort through our bedroom, through the closet where his clothes still hung, through the drawers where his t-shirts still smelled faintly like him, through all the physical evidence that he'd existed, that we'd existed, that this life we'd built together had been real, and I knew that keeping everything forever wasn't healthy, wasn't moving forward, was actually holding me back, was keeping me in a space where I was waiting for him to come back rather than accepting that he never would. But I also knew I couldn't rush it, couldn't force it, couldn't throw everything away just to prove I was healing. So I took my time, touched each item, remembered where he'd worn it, what he'd been doing, what we'd been doing together, and I kept some things: his favorite sweater that I could wear, a t-shirt from a concert we'd attended, the watch his father had given him that I'd have sized to fit me, and I donated the rest, took it to a men's shelter where someone who needed clothes could wear them, could benefit from them, could use them rather than having them hang in a closet like a shrine, like evidence of a life that had stopped. And doing that, letting go of his physical things while keeping the memories, the love, the lessons, it felt like growth, felt like healing, felt like I was finally learning the difference between remembering someone and being trapped by their absence. I also decided to do something about the house, about the space Daniel and I had shared, about the walls that held so many memories. They felt heavy, felt like they were pressing in on me, felt like I was living in a museum dedicated to a life that no longer existed, and I knew I had 2 choices. I could stay, could try to make new memories here, could attempt to reclaim this space as mine alone rather than ours together. Or I could leave, could start completely fresh, could find a new place that didn't have his ghost in every corner, didn't have our history in every room, didn't require me to constantly navigate between past and present. And I chose to leave, chose to sell, chose to find something smaller, something more manageable, something that was just mine from the beginning. And making that decision felt enormous, felt like I was abandoning Daniel, abandoning our life, abandoning the last physical space where we'd been together. But Dr. Chun helped me understand that staying wasn't loyalty, staying was stagnation, staying was choosing to live in the past rather than building a future. And Daniel wouldn't have wanted that, would have hated that, would have told me to move, to grow, to find a space that felt like life rather than like a memorial. So I listed the house, accepted an offer within 2 weeks, and started packing, started sorting 31 years of accumulated life into boxes labeled keep, donate, trash. And with each box I packed, I felt lighter, felt less anchored to the past, felt more free to imagine a future that didn't require permission from ghosts, from memories, from people who weren't here anymore. The new apartment I found was across town, deliberately far from the old neighborhood, from the places Daniel and I had frequented, from the routes we'd driven, from the memories that lived in geography. I needed a clean slate, needed space that was mine alone, and the apartment was small, one bedroom, but it had huge windows that filled the living room with light, had a balcony overlooking a park where I could watch people living their lives, where I could remember that the world was still turning, still full of people who were happy, who were building things, who were moving forward, and moving and felt like rebirth, felt like I was shedding a skin, felt like I was becoming someone new, someone who existed independent of being Daniel's wife, independent of being my family's disappointment, just Jessica, just me, figuring out who I was when I wasn't defined by relationships, by roles, by expectations. And that process, that discovery, it was terrifying and exhilarating, was lonely and liberating, was everything at once, was the hardest work I'd ever done because it required me to sit with myself, to get to know myself, to decide what I actually valued, what I actually wanted, what I actually believed separate from what I'd been taught to value, to want, to believe. And some days I failed, some days I fell back into old patterns, old thoughts, old beliefs that I was broken, was too sensitive, was the problem. But more days I succeeded, more days I remembered that I was enough, that their rejection was their failure, not mine, that Daniel had loved me because I was lovable, not because I'd performed perfectly. And slowly, painfully, incrementally, I started believing it, started internalizing it, started building an identity on truth rather than on trauma, on strength rather than on survival, on choice rather than on obligation. 6 months after the funeral, my mother tried again, not through a letter this time, but through my boss, and the audacity of it, the boundary violation, the assumption that she could access me through my workplace when I'd blocked every personal avenue. It made me furious, made me understand that she didn't respect my boundaries, didn't accept my choice, didn't understand that no meant no. My boss called me into her office looking uncomfortable, apologetic, and said, "Jessica, I received a call from someone claiming to be your mother. She said it was urgent, said it was a family emergency, said she needed to speak with you immediately and couldn't reach you any other way. And I need to know if there's actually an emergency, or if this is something else." And I told her the truth, told her that there was no emergency, that my mother was trying to circumvent boundaries I'd established, that I'd cut off contact for my own mental health. And my boss nodded, said I thought that might be the case. I told her I couldn't give out your personal information, told her that if there was a real emergency she should contact the police and they could reach you, and she got angry, told me I was being obstructionist, told me she'd call corporate, told me she'd make sure I regretted this. So I need to know from you, Jessica, do you want me to take any action? Do you want to file something? Do you want this documented? And I said yes. Yes, I want it documented. Yes, I want a record that she tried to reach me through my workplace after I'd established no contact. Yes, I want protection in case she escalates, because this behavior, this refusal to respect boundaries, it's not going to stop unless I make it stop, unless I make it clear that no means no, that cut off means cut off, that there are consequences for refusing to respect someone's clearly stated limits. That evening I did something I'd been avoiding, something that felt too final, too legal, too much like declaring war. I contacted a lawyer, explained the situation, explained the boundary violations, explained my need for protection, and the lawyer, a woman named Rebecca Torres who specialized in family law, she listened without judgment, without surprise, and when I finished she said, "Jessica, what you're describing is harassment, is stalking behavior, is someone refusing to accept that you have the right to choose who has access to you. And yes, we can file for a restraining order, we can make this legal, we can create consequences if they continue to violate your clearly stated boundaries, but I need you to understand what you're starting, need you to understand that this will make reconciliation virtually impossible, will make this separation permanent, will communicate to your family that you're done, that there's no coming back from this, that the relationship is over, not just in practice but in law, and I need you to be certain, to be absolutely sure, because once we do this there's no taking it back, without looking like you're unstable, like you're making dramatic gestures, like you're someone who can't be taken seriously. So I'm asking you, are you sure? Is this what you want?" And I looked at her, this stranger who was giving me permission to protect myself, who was outlining consequences and asking for certainty, and I said, "Yes, I'm sure, I'm absolutely sure." Because they didn't come to my husband's funeral, because they called my grief selfish, because they refused to respect my boundaries, because they're trying to access me through my workplace, because nothing I've said, nothing I've done, nothing I've communicated has made them stop, has made them understand, has made them respect my choice, and I'm done asking nicely, done hoping they'll respect boundaries voluntarily, done believing that family means they get unlimited chances to hurt me. I want legal protection. I want consequences if they continue. I want them to understand that I meant what I said, that cutting them off wasn't a phase, wasn't grief-induced irrationality, wasn't something that would pass with time. It was a permanent choice based on a lifetime of treatment I will no longer accept. So yes, file the paperwork, do what needs to be done, protect me legally since they won't respect me personally. The restraining order was filed 2 weeks later, served to my mother, my father, and Emma simultaneously, and according to Rebecca, they were shocked, were apparently genuinely surprised that I'd taken legal action, had believed despite everything that I was bluffing, was just going through a phase, would eventually come back, would eventually forgive, would eventually fold the way I'd always folded before, but the legal paperwork, the court documents, the official notice that they were prohibited from contacting me, from coming near my home or workplace, from using third parties to reach me, from any form of communication that made it real, made it official, made it clear that I wasn't coming back, wasn't forgiving, wasn't folding. And Rebecca called me after they'd been served and said, "They're angry, Jessica, they're threatening to fight it, to claim you're unstable, to bring up your grief as evidence that you're not thinking clearly, so I need you to be prepared for them. To make this ugly, to make this public, to try to paint you as the villain, because that's what people do when they lose control. When someone they've controlled successfully for years suddenly establishes boundaries, they don't accept it, they escalate, they attack, they try to make the person who's protecting themselves look like the aggressor, and you need to be ready for that, need to be prepared to stand your ground, need to be willing to let them make you look bad to people who don't matter rather than letting them back into your life where they will absolutely hurt you again." And I said, "I'm ready, I'm prepared. I know they'll try to make me look crazy. We'll probably succeed with some people. We'll definitely succeed with people who don't know the whole story. But I don't care anymore. Don't care what they tell people. Don't care how they paint me. Don't care if I'm the villain in their story, because I'm the hero in mine. I'm the person who finally chose herself, who finally said no more, who finally drew a line and meant it. And that's all that matters. That's all I need. That's the beginning of everything." The hearing for the permanent restraining order happened 8 weeks after I filed, and I had to face them, had to sit in a courtroom with my mother and father and Emma 10 feet away, had to testify about why I needed protection, had to outline the years of emotional abuse, the funeral abandonment, the boundary violations, had to make private pain public, had to expose family dysfunction to a judge and a court reporter, and anyone else who happened to be in the room, and it was excruciating, was humiliating, was exactly as hard as Rebecca had warned it would be, but I did it, told the truth, didn't embellish, didn't dramatize, just stated facts, stated timelines, stated the pattern of behavior that had culminated in my need for legal protection. And my family's lawyer, because of course they'd hired a lawyer, he tried to paint me as unstable, asked about my mental health treatment, asked about my grief, asked if I was on medication, asked if I'd been hospitalized, asked every question, designed to make me look incompetent, irrational, someone whose testimony couldn't be trusted. And I answered calmly, said, "Yes, I'm in therapy. Yes, I'm grieving my husband. Yes, I'm on antidepressants. Yes, I'm in treatment for trauma. And no, none of that makes me incompetent. None of that makes my need for boundaries invalid. None of that means I have to accept abuse from people who claim to love me. Being in pain doesn't mean I'm wrong about needing protection. Being in treatment doesn't mean my perception is flawed. Being medicated doesn't mean my boundaries aren't real." And the judge, a woman in her 60s who'd probably seen 1,000 family cases, she listened, asked clarifying questions, reviewed the evidence, the timeline, the documentation of boundary violations, and she granted the restraining order, made it permanent, said that my family had demonstrated a pattern of refusing to respect clearly stated boundaries, that their behavior constituted harassment, that I had the right to protection, and that for the next 3 years, renewable if needed, they were prohibited from any contact, any communication, any attempt to reach me directly or indirectly, and if they violated the order they would face criminal charges, would face jail time, would face consequences that were real, were legal, were enforceable. And walking out of that courtroom, knowing I was legally protected, knowing they couldn't reach me anymore, knowing the law was on my side, it felt like winning, felt like justice, felt like I'd finally been seen, been heard, been validated by someone with power, and that validation, that official recognition that my need for boundaries was legitimate, was necessary, was legally defensible, It changed something fundamental in how I saw myself, how I understood my story, how I knew that I wasn't crazy, wasn't overreacting, wasn't the villain, was just someone protecting herself from people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with access to her life, her heart, her healing. The months after the restraining order were quieter, were peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced since before Daniel died. I could go to work without worrying about calls to my boss, could check my mail without finding letters, could exist without constantly looking over my shoulder wondering when they'd try again, when they'd find another avenue, when they'd violate another boundary, and that peace, that security. It allowed me to heal in ways I hadn't been able to heal while fighting, while defending, while constantly protecting myself from new attacks. I started sleeping better, stopped having nightmares about the funeral, about standing alone, about being abandoned, started dreaming about other things, about running, about my new apartment, about Daniel smiling, about futures that were possible, and waking up from those dreams didn't devastate me the way it used to, didn't send me spiraling into grief. Just made me grateful, made me remember, made me understand that grief and growth could coexist, that I could miss Daniel and still build a life, that loving someone who died didn't mean dying with them, meant carrying them forward, meant living in a way that honored what they'd given you rather than in a way that mourned what they'd taken when they left. And Daniel had given me so much, had given me the model for real love, for choosing, for presence, for the understanding that I deserved better than what my family had offered, and living that understanding, embodying it, building a life on it. That was how I honored him. That was how I kept him with me, not by staying frozen but by growing, not by staying broken but by healing, not by staying small but by becoming everything he believed I could become when I finally stopped letting people who didn't value me determine my value. I started volunteering at the grief support group, helping Mark facilitate, helping new members navigate those first terrible weeks, helping people understand that survival was possible, that healing was real, that you could lose everything and still build something beautiful from the ruins. And one evening a woman came in, first time, her husband had died 3 weeks earlier, and her family had missed the funeral, had chosen her brother's wedding instead, and listening to her story, hearing my own pain reflected back, seeing her confusion, her hurt, her questioning whether she was being too sensitive, too unforgiving, too harsh. I saw myself, saw who I'd been 6 months ago, and I told her my story, told her about the funeral, about the restraining order, about the choice to cut them off, about the healing that came from choosing myself. And when I finished, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "Do you regret it? Do you regret losing your family?" And I thought about it, really thought about it, gave her the honest answer. I said I regret that I had a family who couldn't love me better. I regret that I had to make that choice, that boundaries were necessary, that legal protection was required, but I don't regret the choice itself. Don't regret cutting off people who hurt me. Don't regret choosing my own healing over their comfort, because the family I lost wasn't actually family, wasn't actually love, was actually a structure built on hierarchy and favoritism. And the understanding that some people matter more than others, and I was the one who mattered less, and staying would have meant accepting that, and I wouldn't, refuse to accept that I deserved less just because I'd been designated the spare daughter. So no, I don't regret it. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing it. And if you're asking because you're thinking about doing the same thing, about cutting off family who abandoned you, I want you to know it's hard. It's lonely, it's going to hurt, but it's also necessary, it's also healing, it's also the beginning of a life where you get to decide who has access to you, who gets to be in your space, who gets to claim the title of family, and that choosing, that agency, that power, it changes everything, it saves everything, it makes possible a future that actually feels like yours. 1 year after Daniel's funeral, 1 year after standing alone in that chapel, 1 year after learning exactly what I meant to the people who claimed to love me, I woke up in my new apartment with sunlight streaming through windows that faced east, warming my face, and I realized something that made me cry, made me laugh, made me feel both broken and whole simultaneously. I realized I was okay, not healed, not fixed, not done grieving, but okay, functional, moving forward, building something. And that okay felt miraculous after spending months believing I'd never feel anything except devastation, never experience anything except absence, never be anything except the shell of who I'd been when Daniel was alive. But here I was, 1 year later, drinking coffee on my balcony, watching joggers in the park below, planning my day, existing, surviving, actually living. And the guilt that came with that realization was immediate, was crushing, was the voice that said, "How dare you be okay? How dare you feel anything except grief? How dare you move forward when Daniel can't? How dare you build a life when it's ended?" But I'd learned in therapy, through Dr. Chen's patient persistent guidance, that guilt was part of grief, that survivor's guilt was normal, was expected, was something every widow experienced, and that the way through it wasn't to stop living, wasn't to stay frozen, wasn't to punish yourself for surviving, was to live intentionally, was to build meaning, was to honor the person you lost by becoming someone they'd be proud of, someone who took the love they gave you and used it as foundation rather than as a monument. And Daniel would be proud. I knew that with absolute certainty. Knew he'd be proud that I'd left my family, proud that I'd chosen myself, proud that I was building a life that reflected my own values rather than performing for people who'd never appreciate the performance. And that knowing, that certainty about what he'd think, what he'd want, what he'd say if he could see me now, it made the guilt easier to carry. Made it possible to be okay and still miss him. Made it possible to move forward and still remember. Made it possible to live and still love someone who was gone. I'd started dating again, which felt both too soon and too late. Felt like betrayal and necessity. Felt like I was replacing Daniel, except I knew you couldn't replace people, couldn't find substitutes for someone you'd loved that deeply, could only find different, could only build new, could only create something that honored what came before without trying to recreate it. And the man I'd been seeing for 2 months, his name was Marcus. No relation to Emma's Marcus, thankfully, and he was a teacher, patient, kind, someone who'd also lost a spouse 3 years earlier to cancer, someone who understood grief, who didn't expect me to be over it, who didn't require me to pretend Daniel never existed, who made space for my past while building something new. And our first date had been coffee, just coffee, nothing dramatic, nothing romantic, just two people who understood loss sitting in a cafe talking about books, about teaching, about grief groups, about how strange it felt to want connection when you'd been so thoroughly broken by losing connection. And Marcus had said something that stuck with me, had said the hardest part of losing someone is learning that you're capable of loving again, capable of opening yourself up to potential loss again, capable of being brave enough to care about someone when you absolutely know, that everyone you love will eventually leave whether they want or not, whether through death or betrayal, or just the natural entropy of relationships, and being willing to do it anyway, to love anyway, to risk anyway. That's what makes us human, what makes us alive, what makes us more than just survival machines. And I'd cried in that cafe, had embarrassed myself completely, but Marcus just handed me napkins and said it's okay. I cried on my first date too, which had made me laugh through tears, had made me feel seen, had made me understand that maybe, possibly, eventually, there could be something good again, something worth having, something that didn't erase Daniel, but existed alongside his memory. My grief support group had become family in ways my actual family never was. These people who'd experienced similar losses, who understood that grief wasn't linear, wasn't logical, wasn't something you got over like a cold. Patricia, who'd lost her husband and cut off her son. James, who'd lost his wife and struggled with his in-laws who blamed him for not saving her. Michelle, who'd lost her partner and discovered her parents were more concerned about what the neighbors thought than about her pain. We'd formed a bond, had started meeting outside the official sessions, going to dinner, watching movies, celebrating birthdays, supporting each other through hard days. And these people, these strangers who'd become friends, who'd become chosen family, they showed me what family was supposed to be. People who showed up, who chose you, who valued you, who didn't keep score, who didn't create hierarchies, who didn't make love conditional. And building that family, creating that support system from scratch with people who understood loss, who understood boundaries, who understood that blood doesn't create obligation, that was healing, was revolutionary, was proof that I could have family, could have belonging, could have connection that wasn't toxic, wasn't harmful, wasn't built on the understanding that I was less important than someone else. I got a promotion at work, a significant one, team leader position that came with more responsibility, more money, more recognition. And when my boss told me, when she said, "Jessica, you've done remarkable work this year, you've grown, you've led projects, you've supported your team, you've earned this," I cried. Not because I was sad, but because someone saw me, valued me, recognized effort, and rewarded it. And I realized that this was the first time in my life I'd achieved something significant. Without immediately thinking about how my family would react, without wondering if they'd be proud, if they'd care, if Emma had achieved something bigger that would overshadow my accomplishment, without the automatic diminishing of my own success that came from years of being taught that my achievements didn't matter as much, and that freedom, that ability to feel proud without immediately qualifying it, without immediately comparing it, without immediately making myself smaller. It was intoxicating, was proof that cutting them off hadn't just removed toxicity, had actually created space for me to exist fully, to be proud, to celebrate myself without waiting for external validation that would never come or would come wrapped in comparisons that made the validation worthless. I found out through a mutual acquaintance, someone who knew my family and didn't know about the restraining order, that Emma had married Marcus Wellington in what was apparently the social event of the season, and my first reaction was relief. Relief that I hadn't been invited. Relief that I didn't have to make another choice about attending or not attending. Relief that the restraining order had protected me from even being asked, and my second reaction was curiosity, just mild interest in how the wedding went, whether Emma had gotten everything she wanted, whether my parents had performed perfectly, whether the whole thing had been as spectacular as Emma had probably envisioned. But that curiosity was distant, was the kind you have about strangers, about people you used to know, not the sharp, painful jealousy I would have felt a year ago, not the comparison, not the why does she get everything and I get nothing, just oh, that happened, interesting, and moving on. And that emotional distance, that lack of investment, that genuine indifference, it proved something important, proved that I'd healed, proved that they didn't have power over me anymore, proved that Emma's happiness or success or perfect wedding didn't diminish me, didn't affect me, didn't make me feel less than because I'd built a life that didn't include her, didn't revolve around her, didn't require her absence or presence to be valid, and that independence, that emotional autonomy, it was everything, was freedom, was the whole point of the last year of work and therapy and boundaries and choosing myself over and over until it became automatic, became natural, became who I was rather than something I had to consciously choose. I also found out, through the same acquaintance who maybe should have been more careful about what she told me, that my mother had been telling people I'd had a mental breakdown, that I'd become unstable after Daniel's death, that I'd cut off the family during a grief-induced episode, that they were worried about me, that they'd tried to help but I'd refused, that they were just waiting for me to get better, to come to my senses, to realize I needed them, and hearing how she'd rewritten history, how she'd made herself the concerned mother and me the unstable daughter. I felt anger initially, felt the injustice of it, felt the urge to correct the record, to tell everyone the truth, to make sure people knew what really happened, but then I realized something that changed my reaction completely. I realized I didn't care what she told people, didn't care how she explained my absence, didn't care if the whole town thought I was crazy. Because the people who mattered, the people who actually knew me, who actually cared about me, who actually showed up for me, those people knew the truth, knew what had happened, knew why I'd cut them off, and everyone else, everyone who was willing to believe her story without asking me, without questioning, without wondering if maybe there was another side, those people didn't matter, weren't my people, weren't anyone I needed to convince. And letting go of that need, that desperate need to control the narrative, to make sure everyone knew I was right and she was wrong, that letting go was liberating, was proof that I'd really moved on, really healed, really reached a place where their opinion of me didn't determine my opinion of myself. 2 years after Daniel's death, I stood at his grave on the anniversary, brought flowers, stood there for a long time just talking to him, updating him on my life, telling him about Marcus, about the promotion, about the apartment, about cutting off my family, about the restraining order, about all the ways I'd survived without him, all the ways I'd grown, all the ways I'd become someone he'd be proud of, and I told him thank you for loving me, for showing me what real love looked like, for leaving me those notes, for writing in that journal, for protecting me even after death, for giving me the foundation I needed to build a life that was actually mine. And I told him I missed him, would always miss him, would carry him with me, but that I was okay, was building something, was happy sometimes, was learning to exist in a world without him, and that existing didn't mean forgetting, didn't mean replacing, just meant living, just meant moving forward, just meant honoring what he'd given me by not staying frozen, by not staying broken, by not letting his death be the end of my story, and standing there, feeling the sun on my face, feeling the wind, feeling connected to him, and to myself, and to the life I was building, I understood something profound, something that had taken 2 years to learn. Grief doesn't end, doesn't resolve, doesn't reach a point where you're done. You just learn to carry it, learn to live alongside it, learn to build a life that has space for loss and space for joy, space for missing and space for moving forward, space for past and space for future. And that space, that expansiveness, that refusal to let loss be the only story, it was healing, was growth, was the whole point of surviving, not just to survive, but to live, really live, fully live, in a way that honored everyone who couldn't. I'm Jessica Carter, and I'm 33 now. 2 years older than I was when Daniel died. 2 years older than I was when my family abandoned me. 2 years into a life I built from absolute destruction. And I want to tell anyone watching this who's been abandoned by family, who's been told their grief doesn't matter, who's been made to feel like their pain is less important than someone else's celebration. I want to tell you that you can survive it, that choosing yourself isn't selfish, that setting boundaries isn't betrayal, that walking away from people who hurt you isn't failure. It's survival. It's healing. It's the beginning of a life where you get to decide who has access to you, who gets to be called family, who gets to stay, and that power, that agency, that ability to choose, it changes everything. It saves everything. It makes possible a future you can't imagine right now but will be grateful for later. And if you're in the middle of it, if you're standing at your own grave watching people who should be there choose something else, if you're wondering whether you're overreacting, whether you're being too harsh, whether you should forgive and forget and go back, I want you to know that you're not overreacting. You're finally reacting appropriately. You're finally valuing yourself enough to require people to show up, to choose you, to prove that their love is real and not just performance. And if they can't do that, if they can't show up when it matters most, then they don't get access to you when it matters least. They don't get the good parts if they won't show up for the hard parts. They don't get to claim family if they won't act like family, and walking away, cutting them off. Choosing yourself, that's not cruelty, that's self-respect, that's survival, that's the beginning of everything, and I promise you from someone who's on the other side, who's survived it, who's building something beautiful from the ashes, I promise you it gets better, not easier exactly, not without pain, not without grief, but better, more authentic, more real, more yours, and that ownership, that autonomy, that freedom to be yourself without apology, without performance, without shrinking to fit someone else's expectations. That's worth everything, worth the loneliness, worth the hard conversations, worth the legal battles, worth all of it, because at the end of all that hardship is you, really you, the person you were always supposed to be. Before family taught you to be smaller, quieter, less, and that person, that fully realized version of yourself, she's worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth choosing over and over again until choosing yourself becomes as natural as breathing. And if this story helped you, if you needed to hear that survival is possible, that healing is real, that you can lose everything and still build something beautiful, then share it. Share it with someone who needs to know they're not alone, who needs to know that family isn't always blood, that love isn't always conditional, that there are people out there who will choose you, who will show up for you, who will prove that you're worth showing up for. And those people, that chosen family, that earned love, it's better than what you lost. It's stronger than blood. It's the foundation everything else gets built on. So choose yourself, protect yourself, walk away from people who can't love you right, and build something beautiful, something real, something that's actually yours because you deserve it. You've always deserved it, and now, finally, hopefully, you're ready to believe it.